Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to tonight's lecture. Today we're going to focus on the Middle Assyrian period, which is one of the most interesting for me, and I hope it becomes an interesting one for you because so many things have happened. I'm sharing with you a photograph or a painting, an illustration or a painting that's based on, of course, the imagination of an artist of Tukulti-Ninurta punishing one of the enemies. And the reason I share it is because it has such a memory for me, because this picture in black and white was reproduced in black and white in Menashe Amira's Shamshi-Adad, or the history of Assyria, published in the 1960s, that reached us in Iraq in 1972, I believe, or 73. So the reason I mention that is because in each of these lectures, I'm going to give you a kind of a little bit of a summary of Assyrian experience. We're not only going to focus on the history of the Assyrians, but also on reflections on the history of the Assyrians and how we came to find out our history. Now, even though this illustration was reproduced in Menashe Amira's Shamshi-Adad, which was written in Assyrian, and I was a child when I used to read that book or look at that book, and I couldn't understand Assyrian. I would guess what's there and stare at this particular illustration, imagining what life was like in the ancient past. This, in fact, this illustration comes from the National Geographic magazine, reproduced in the United States. And so what does that tell us? That tells us a lot of the knowledge that Assyrians had of their history, particularly ancient history, came from American and British and French sources, Western sources. That doesn't make the history, of course, any less relevant or important, but it's just the way that the Assyrians reached their history in modern times. So it was really reading of a lot of Western literature, and that's one of the reasons why this history class is in English. Most of the sources we deal with when it comes to ancient history are not, unfortunately, in modern Assyrian history. So, for example, you will see a lot of books written in modern-day Hebrew now about history of Israel and Judah. You will not see the same with Assyrian history, the ancient past. You will see a lot of books written in Arabic about, say, Islamic history, but it's not the same in Assyrian history. So when we're talking about the ancient period, our reliance is almost exclusively on English, German, French, and other Western sources, and even Russian, and of late, there are also writings in the Turkish language on ancient Assyrian history. So with that in mind, let's go to what we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to split this period in time in Assyrian history into two: the Middle Assyrian period and the challenges to Assyrian power in the Middle Assyrian period. I'm going to touch on a part of the challenges to Assyrian power in this presentation, but I'm going to save the details of it, the most important part of it, for the second part of the lecture, which will come next week. Same time, same place next week. So we're going to first talk about, so that you have a general understanding, we have a general understanding of what's going on, the Near East setting. What was the setting like in the Near East during the time of the Middle Assyrian period? We're going to talk about Egypt and the Hittites. These are both very important powers as Assyrian regional power grows. We're going to talk about Babylonia. Remember, I mentioned that Babylonia is kind of a superimposed, extrinsic term imposed on Babylonia, but the Kassites were there at the time, and the term used for this area was Kurdanesh. And the Assyrians referred to the area with that term, and also with Salman and Eked. Babylonia was not used. We're going to talk about Mitanni, which is misspelled there, unfortunately, and what the Assyrians knew as Hani-Galbat. Hani-Galbat was the term that the Assyrians, sometimes Hani-Galbat, the Assyrians used this term for the area of Mitanni. The Mitanni was a conglomeration of Hurrian tribes and states brought into what became an empire that ruled over a large part of northeastern Syria, Anatolia, and also northern Mesopotamia. Then we're going to talk about the state structure of the Assyrian state structure and its development, transformation in monarchy. We're going to talk about how Assyrian monarchy was in the past in what we knew as the Old Assyrian Period, 2000 to about, say, 1600 BC. And we're going to talk about the creation of the provinces, which made the Middle Assyrian period a very unique period because the provinces did not exist, although parts of them, some authors speculate, may have existed in the Old Assyrian period. It's really a newer innovation of Assyrian history. We're going to talk about Assyrian regional power and the beginnings of the world empire that Assyria was going to become. We're also going to touch on Middle Assyrian laws, and this is a topic that I'm very interested in, and we're going to revisit that topic at a future time. But today I'm just going to give you kind of a sample and an understanding of what are known as Middle Assyrian laws. So we left early Ashur last time, thousands of years behind, and we understood that the period really had begun, or was kind of marked by historians as with the arrival of Assur, one of the Assyrian kings, on the Assyrian kings list. The term for Assyrian kings during that time was governor, or an overseer, Ensi in Sumerian, Akkadian, Ishaku. The ruler was seen as chief servant to the god Ashur. The term king, or Sharu in Akkadian, was not used at that time. There was a role for the city assembly, as we said, the city hall. Karen Radner, an Assyriologist, has referred to this period in time as a kind of a parliamentary monarchy in Assyrian history, not as an absolute monarchy. And there were other institutions that worked in conjunction with the ruler to establish law and order. And there was, according to one author, Wienhoff, there's a reference oftentimes to something called according to the words of the stele. According to the words of the stele. When people made agreements, they would refer to the stele. Now, you know of one particular stele that is very well known, and that is the stele of Hammurabi, the Hammurabi Code, and we're going to talk about that just briefly today. During the reign of Irushum I, 1974-1935 BC, royal inscriptions describe temple and city building activities in the Assyrian heartland and the Assyrian Limu official. The Limu was an official under the king. He was subservient to the king, and the year was marked according to a particular Limu official. And that way, historians have been able to date the Assyrian system. There was no year in particular like we use today, for example, the Christian year or the Greek year, and so on. So the head of City Hall, this position of the Limu came into prominence at this time. This Limu official title continued into Assyrian history, into Middle Assyrian history, and long into the neo-Assyrian history, which we're going to talk about. Long-distance trade flourished under Irushum I and his successors until the time of Shamshi-Adad. The Assyrian state expanded into northern Mesopotamia during the time of Shamshi-Adad. After his death, the growth of the Assyrian state was halted. His descendants, his sons, were not able to keep what he had done. And then we have, although we have some of the merchant records, just like we had in the old Assyrian period, they are not that much. And so we go into what a lot of historians call after this kind of the dark ages, although Assyria existed certainly, but the reason for that is because we lack records. We just don't have the records that we had, for example, in the old Assyrian period. They have not been found. Shamshi-Adad was known to be a bit of a control freak. He was a nice guy sometimes, a tough guy sometimes. He ruled from 1808 until 1776 BC. He admired his son Ishmi-Dagan I as a competent ruler, but not his brother or his other son, Yasmah-Adad. I don't need to read these out loud to you. You can read them, but one of them is chides his son because he feels he hasn't accomplished what his other son has accomplished, and says, "Are you a child, not a man? Have you no beard on your chin?" And then he tells him again in another letter, "While here your brother is victorious," because he cites a long repertoire of accomplishments by his other son. "Down there you lie about among the women," meaning you're doing nothing and just enjoying yourself. Having arranged the marriage to his son Yasmah-Adad to Princess Biltum, Shamshi-Adad insisted that she take the place of his first wife. He also sent a letter because his son did not want to place Biltum, who was the daughter of Ishi-Adu, a friend of Shamshi-Adad, an ally, I should say. Shamshi-Adad insisted that Biltum have the first role as the first wife, or the lady of the palace, and thanks her father for sending her, and says, "I heard that you gladly dispatched my daughter-in-law on a safe way back to me, that you treated my servants when they stayed with you well, and that they were not hindered at all. My heart is very happy." This gives you an idea of the diplomacy at the time and the harshness of a ruler under possibly a tremendous amount of pressure. And then after Shamshi-Adad, the record sort of goes dark for Ashur, but then we know that Hammurabi reigns supreme in Mesopotamia. And that is from 1810 until 1750. After, of course, Shamshi-Adad's death, Hammurabi takes over. And Hammurabi, in his law code, describes himself as ruler of all of Mesopotamia. The pious prince, this is in the prologue, the pious prince who venerates the gods to make justice prevail in the land, to abolish the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. This, by the way, this type of line, you'll hear again and again from different Assyrian kings. Sennacherib, who's been, unfortunately, his memory has been desecrated by various writers throughout history, and he's been blamed for being a very difficult king, a very ruthless and cruel king. Also takes pride in protecting the weak from the strong. But Hammurabi here tells us that he proclaims truth and he guides the population properly and restores the benevolent spirit of the city of Ashur, and who quells the rebellious, and the king who proclaims the rights for the goddess Ishtar in the city of Nineveh in the Emeshmesh temple. So the cities that Hammurabi takes care of, there's not this, remember last time I referred to it as an understanding that it was the Babylonians versus the Assyrians. Certainly this law code, which is a very important document, does not give you the idea that the Babylonians and the Assyrians were simply killing each other. Now, taking a look at kind of a map of the Middle East, we see that at this time, we see that Egypt was a very important state. The Hittite state in Anatolia is very important, and the Mitanni to the east, to the west of Assyria, is also a very important state. What's happening in Egypt is that in 1650, so this is prior to our time, a people called the Hyksos invaded Egypt. This is a Greek term for invaders of the land. Invaded Egypt and established the 15th dynasty. The 15th dynasty focused on the northern part of Egypt because this existed along with the 16th and 17th dynasties, which were in Thebes, more south in Egypt. The Hyksos were expelled with their last king, Hammurabi, from Egypt about 1580 BC by Pharaoh Ahmose I. After expelling the Hyksos, the native Egyptian New Kingdom rulers began to assertively control their borders, and under Thutmose III controlled Canaan. Now, if you are interested in biblical history, this is kind of this period, and afterwards is the period of supposedly Moses and the Israelite kings. And so it's important to look at this period in time and try to understand what really happened in Canaan. And there's a whole set of archaeologists, and at the time before they were called biblical archaeologists. Now they're no longer really called biblical archaeologists. They focus on Israel and Canaan, Canaanite studies. And what we find is that Egypt dominated the area during this time. And so there's a battle between the Hittites and the Egyptians over influence of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Assyrians have not yet stepped into this conflict between Egypt and the Hittites. And as I said, the term Hyksos refers to the foreign dynasty that inhabited and held power in Egypt, and these were thought to be from the Levant. And there's archaeological evidence to show that the people who invaded Egypt were coming from, a lot of writers think, a lot of scholars think that they came from northern Syria and slowly made their way into Egypt and eventually conquered Egypt and built their own dynasty there. The Hittites ruled in what is today largely Turkey, but also northern Syria and parts of Mesopotamia. And the Hittite Empire reigned supreme from 1600 and then began to lose power in the 1200s, largely because of the collapse of the Mitanni and the growth of Assyrian power, which we will talk about. Shukil-uli-Yuma is the good pronunciation. I'm proud of myself. Is the king of the Hittites that is the most powerful and accomplished in the line of Hittite kings. The kings who followed him were Murshidi II, but they were never able to achieve what he had achieved. So the Hittite Empire eventually came to collapse. Now it takes a few hundred years, of course, but by the year 1200 BC, the empire is gone and the region was conquered by the Assyrians. Not the entire Anatolian region, but a large part of northern Syria and Anatolia. Now the Egypt and the Hittites were coming to clash over the Eastern Mediterranean, and they battled, and there's a famous battle, one of the most documented battles that took place. Most archaeologists and historians think around 1274 BC, the Battle of Kadesh. It's one of the best documented of the battles in the ancient world, and that's the Ramses II and the Hittites under Muwatalli II. And that was in the city of Kadesh in the Orontes River near modern Lebanon and Syria border. The battle is generally dated to this time from Egyptian chronology and is the earliest battle in recorded history. Hittites and Egypt, after doing battle and both claiming victory, are both concerned about the growing power of Assyria. And there you see what Ramses II, because based on his mummy, of course, we roughly know what he looked like, although, of course, this is speculation, lots of AI. On the other hand, for Mutawalli The second, the Hittite, we don't know what he looks like, but there's an artist giving you his best shot. In the southern area of Mesopotamia, in what is known as Babylonia or Sumer and Akkad, the Kassites, who are thought to be a people originating in the Zagros Mountains, have come into Mesopotamia. They slowly filtered into Mesopotamia and ruled southern Mesopotamia or Babylonia, and named it, of course, Karduniash, which is what Assyrians referred to it as well. Again, the term Babylonia was not used. As you know, Babylon is one city. Babylonia is an invention later of Greeks and Romans who applied the term to the country long after Babylon was no longer significant. To the west of the Assyrians is the state of Mitanni. Mitanni is a Hurrian state. The Hurrians are a people who are similar to, they're not related to any other people. They are similar to the Urartians. So they're a native group of around the Caucasus. They are not Indo-European, although there's speculation, there's a theory that they were ruled by an Indo-European class of people, but the Mitanni language is not Indo-European, it is Hurrian. So in the 16th and 15th centuries, the kingdom of the Mitanni, made up of various tribes and states, rules over northern Mesopotamia and north Syria and parts of Anatolia. The most prominent rulers were Kirta, the first one, Shaturana or Shatarna, and these are their names, and these are the kings that ruled in the 15 and 1400s. Now, it's interesting that there's also a reference, and it was brought to my attention that some of the names of the early Assyrian kings list, although I had to really find this myself, had been of Hurrian origin, but I don't know any source that refers to these names being Hurrian on the Assyrian kings list. But certainly there is something interesting, and that is one of the goddesses of the Hurrians was referred to as the Queen of Nineveh. So Nineveh is very old. I apologize. Nineveh is very old and thought to be of perhaps non-Assyrian origin in the beginning. Later, of course, as the Assyrian state grew, Assyrians grew into what became a powerful state and then later an empire. But the record is scant. We have to kind of speculate, and we hate to speculate when the record is not there. So the Mitanni also engaged the Egyptians, and if you look at this map, you get an idea of what's happening. And that is that the Hittites are to the northwest of the Mitanni, the Egyptians are to the southwest of the Mitanni, and the Assyrians are to the east. And the Mitanni have a tough time of it, and they're speculating if they're going to survive or not. And eventually, of course, they fall apart, largely due to the growth of Assyrian power, along with internal divisions among themselves, and slowly they are swallowed up into what becomes Assyria. During the 14th century, the kingdom of Mitanni is beginning to fade as Hittite power grows. As we said, Hittite monarchy and empire is becoming powerful and ruling in central Anatolia with influence and control over various parts of what is today Turkey. So the Hittite empire grows. It's got its own challenges to the west. We don't want to get into that at this time. But the Hittite empire clashes with the Mitanni, and the Mitannis become vassals of first the Hittites and later the Assyrians. So this is what the area looks like in terms of geography during the 1500s up until the 1300s. The Mitanni have their power in kind of the Western Mesopotamian, northwestern Mesopotamian area. The Hittites have their power in Anatolia, the Egyptians, of course, in Egypt and parts of Canaan. The Kassites in the southern part of Mesopotamia, and the Elamite kingdom, the Middle Elamite kingdom, in what later becomes known as Persia or southern Persia. What it's going to look like once the Middle Assyrian Empire gets going, or the Middle Assyrian state, is something like this. The Mitanni are defeated. The Assyrians push other Hurrians out and dominate their heartland and eventually grow to take over the northwestern part of Mesopotamia, or what is the Habur Valley in Syria, go deep into Syria, into Karkamish near Aleppo, and then push towards the Urartians, particularly during the reign of Shalmaneser I, and then south toward Babylon. We're going to talk about how Ashur-uballit pushes toward Babylon. He asserts himself towards Babylon, and how Tukulti-Ninurta deals a very fatal blow to the city and to his rival in the 1200s. Now, as you can see, there's major growth in terms of Assyrian power from the Old Assyrian period to the Middle Assyrian period. So we have the establishment of, in the beginning, a state that sets up provinces, creates provinces, and districts in various places, organizes them according to the link between various officials up until the Assyrian king. And it's the first time we really hear that an Assyrian king calls himself that. The Assyrians are beginning to organize themselves as a regional power similar to other kingdoms. So if we look back on old Assyrian history, we know that the Assyrian king, or the ruler, was the chief priest. He was divinely chosen to lead his people as a kind of a cleric, similar to what a patriarch would be. And this was in concert with the popular assembly, although the term popular assembly probably doesn't fit. It was more like established families that ruled the assembly of Ashur, and he provided religious and spiritual guidance to the people of Assyria. So Assyria goes from a parliamentary democracy to an absolute monarchy during the reign of the Middle Assyrian kings. Old period, again, is marked by a parliamentary monarchy where kings served as the chief priest and representative of the god Ashur. The Middle period saw the arrival of powerful Assyrian kings who become commanders of the military and reduce the power of the aristocratic families in Ashur, the ones who were running the popular assembly, if you will. Assyrian identity continued, but was evolving and growing, meaning as you're growing your provinces, the state is growing, the identity of who's an Assyrian changes. It's no longer just people living in the city-state of Ashur now. The old Assyria was a merchant power, and the Middle Assyria was a political and military regional power. Now, when does the Middle Assyrian period exactly start? And of course, this is speculation, but typically I would prefer the period of the year 1392, or around 1390, of King Adad, who came to power during that time and is thought to have been the first in the line of these strong kings. He was the father of Ashur-uballit I, and we're going to talk about him a little bit. And here is his stele, found in city of Ashur in Iraq. And this period, although it represents a bit of a break from the past, don't forget there's also a continuity. So if we look at the Assyrian kings list, and again, one of the authors attributes the Assyrian kings list to an invention of Ashur-uballit. It goes from Ashur-uballit son of Ashur-uballit I, who ruled for 8 years from 1398 to 1392. These are identifiable kings, all the way to Tiglath-Pileser II, and then begins the New Assyrian period. So there's continuity between the Old, the Middle, and the Neo-Assyrian period. And although we break them up, it is important to recognize that the maintenance of a regional power, that the Assyrians maintained a regional power for quite some time, hundreds of years, possibly more than any other kingdom in the Middle East. If you count the years from, say, 1365 until 609 BC, that's hundreds of years, close to 700 or over 700 years of rule in the Middle East. And very few Near Eastern kingdoms have maintained that type of reign. Amir Harak, who's a professor now of Aramaic and Syriac studies, but who's also an Assyriologist, refers to these kings as Assyria's energetic kings in his seminal study, Assyria and Hanigalba, a historical reconstruction of bilateral relations from the middle to the 12th centuries BC. Ashur-uballit is the very first one, starting in 1363. Enlil-Nirari, less significant, Adad-narari less significant, and then Adad-narari I, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I. These are Assyria's energetic kings, according to Amir Harak. And the way they approach is the way the continuity that they have there for over a century shows that Assyria was on its way to becoming a major regional power that was not to be contested until 609 or 612 BC. So according to Jonathan Balk, who wrote the article Origins of the Assyrian Kings List, which I will share with you, politically, Ashur-uballit's reign is an unmistakable transitional point. Before him, Assyria was a polity centered on the city of Ashur, as we said, with little influence beyond it. There is a little influence, but it's not that much, often enthralled to its more powerful neighbors. After him, Assyria was a territorial entity, beholden to none of its neighbors, and with increasingly justified great power pretensions. And in one of the passages, Ashur-uballit writes to the Hittite king, calling him a brother, and he's chastised because he's thought to be an upstart, the first in a line of kings who really should not be on the same stage as the Hittite king. Remember, the Hittites had created their empire, their rule, prior to Assyria's growth, pretensions to great power. But later, the Hittites rethought their point, and they're kind of much kinder in their letters to the Assyrian king. Ashur-uballit not only adopts the royal title, but does so in relation to Mat Ashur, the land of Ashur, rather than in relation to the city or god. And this is very important during the Middle Assyrian period. This innovation is the earliest known expression of an Assyrian political identity that is conceived in territorial terms. The new royal title and its implicit claim to territorial control are indicative of an effort to refashion Assyria in the mold of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, which were similarly organized on the basis of king and country, although the province system, again, is unique to the Assyrians. And the term that the ancient Assyrian or Akkadian that is used is Pahutu or Pahutu. Bel Pahiti is the ruler of the province. Sheknu is another one, and Hal-Zuhnu is another one. So I ran these terms by a friend of mine who's very good in our classical language, and unfortunately, up until now, we can't identify similar terms. Of course, terms in various languages over a period of thousands of years and possibly lack of usage drop out of vocabulary. But these are the terms the Assyrians used to refer to the system of provinces. Ashur-uballit establishes himself with the title of king or sharu. This is, again, the first time ever used. Any ruler has done this. He begins to expand the Assyrian state and to build an empire and demand recognition of Assyria by the Hittites, Egyptians, and the Kassites. As the Mitanni declined, with one side of its rulers siding with the Assyrians and the other opposing them, Ashur-uballit overpowers the Mitanni, and Mitanni becomes a vassal state to Assyria. So the tables are now turned. Now the Assyrians are facing the Egyptians and the Hittites. In Assyria, Ashur-uballit, for many scholars, I cited one at least, or two with Amir Harak, initiates the beginning of the Middle Assyrian period. He is the first Assyrian king who writes to the pharaoh. And he writes, please do not hold the messenger, after laying out that the messenger is there to visit the pharaoh and to get information. Please do not hold the messenger I sent to see you. Let him see you and examine your opinions and the situation in your country. And of course, to come back to Assyria and to report on what he has seen. And this particular tablet that has been found and translated is part of what's called the Amarna letters. This is a place in Egypt where a lot of these tablets were stored because they were sent, obviously, to the pharaoh to read and kept until they were discovered in the late 1800s. Ashur-uballit sent two diplomatic letters to Amen-Ophis the fourth, the pharaoh of Egypt. The first is a salutation accompanying a number of luxury gifts to the pharaoh. The second, written after the fall of the Mitanni, presents the Assyrian king as a brother of the pharaoh. Again, remember that when he first extends his greeting to the Hittite king, it's thought to be kind of there's a lack of protocol there because he's not a brother after all. He's not part of the big boys club. Well, the Assyrian king now is a member of the big boys club, and the Assyrians in the Middle Assyrian Empire begin to establish themselves as a regional and a world power. The Kassites are not happy about this, and they ruled in Soma and Eked, refused to recognize initially Assyria's newfound power. On learning that the Assyrian delegation was sent to the Egyptian court, the Kassite king, Burnaburash II, sends a brief letter to the pharaoh claiming that the Assyrians were still his vassals and asking that their mission be ignored. Why did they come in your land on their own? If you love me, let them not carry any purchase, let them go away empty-handed. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the Assyrians were the Kassites, the vassals of the Kassite king. It merely means that this is the opinion of the Kassite king. And later, of course, the king of Babylon is not able to challenge Assyria's growing power and makes peace with Ashur-uballit. And in fact, Ashur-uballit gives his daughter in marriage to the king of Babylon. And they have a grandson. And unfortunately, the grandson is murdered, forcing Ashur-uballit to conquer Babylon and to install a puppet ruler at that time. So what's happening is that during this Middle Assyrian period, of course, Assyria's power is growing, and Egypt, the Hittites, and Kassite Babylonia, and especially the Mitanni come to see in Assyria a regional power on the move. In addition to Ashur-uballit during this period, his great-grandson Adad-narari takes power, and Adad-narari is one of the few Assyrian kings during the Middle Assyrian period whose image we can see. And there it is. His stele is now visible in a museum. And he refers to himself as the illustrious prince, honored of the gods, Lord, viceroy of the gods, city founder, and so on, destroyer of the mighty host of the Kassites, the Kuti, or the Guti, and other peoples. This was kind of a familiar pattern of speaking or writing at the time. Various kings would write and boast of their accomplishments on their steles. Adad-narari also left inscriptions telling us of how an upstart king, um, Shatawara the first, challenged his might, and so he had to go in and teach him a lesson. And he brought him to the city of Ashur, and once he repented, he was sent back. So Adad-narari was not as mean as perhaps Assyrian kings are often thought to be. So he allows the king to return as long as he keeps his word. One of the things that we see over and over again is that Assyrian kings valued treaties or alliances and people who swore an oath, in particular kings who swore oaths, and that once you violated this, you're not only violating your word with a particular land or a particular king or monarch, but you're also doing something against the god because you swore your word, oftentimes under the auspices of a particular god, such as, for example, the god Ashur. Here, just as an example, are two weapons that have come down with the marking of Adad-narari's name on them. So how is the Middle Assyrian period? We named some things different from the neo-Assyrian period we're going to study, which is going to come in the future. Military and political perspective, the line of kings in the heartland is continuous, and military achievements of the kings were significant. Ashur-uballit I, Tukulti-Ninurta and others, DeKelaita comes later, all achieved great military victories and expanded the territory of Assyria. The archaeological evidence suggests greater continuity between Middle and Neo-Assyrian period, and I would say, according to some authors, even between the Middle and Old Assyrian period, although you've heard it over and over again. The first time that an Assyrian ruler refers to himself as a sharu or king is during the reign of Ashur-uballit. So there's there a clear distinction between referencing one's kingdom, because you're kind of reorganizing, and of course the provinces, which are going to be revisited again during the Neo-Assyrian period. Tukulti-Ninurta, who is the son of Shalmaneser I, ruled for 37 years. And Tukulti-Ninurta ascended the throne at the time of great tension between Assyria and the Hittites. His father, Shalmaneser I, had defeated the kingdom of the Mitanni, or Hani-Galbat, which had served, and of course, it took a little while to fully defeat the Mitanni. It wasn't just the work of Ashur-uballit, it was the work of successive Assyrian kings, and eventually, not every Mitanni stronghold was defeated the same way, because Assyria eventually incorporated into the Assyrian state structure provinces that were originally Mitanni, and it seems that in certain areas the Mitanni were more amiable towards peaceful resolution with the Assyrians, whereas in other places they were not. So it wasn't an even and consistent kind of an approach, either military or diplomatic and administrative. It was a combination of both. The Kassites eventually come to an end. There are two factors. These are external factors. Tukulti-Ninurta I, who pursued a tough policy of expansion, invaded Babylon and deposed Kashtelyash IV, whom he took as prisoner to Ashur. After acting as king of Babylon for a year, Tukulti-Ninurta appointed a succession of rulers for a decade. The Kassites resumed control, but because of Elam's raids into the area, the Kassite dynasty was defeated. But Assyria began to dominate Babylonia for centuries, eventually centuries. Tukulti-Ninurta describes to the king of Ugarit his preparations for battle with the Hatti, or the Hittites. I called my camp herald, put on your armor and mount your chariot. The king of Hatti arrives in battle order. I harnessed my chariot and made a charge, shouting The king of Hatti comes ready to do battle. Certainly, I won a great victory. And so the Assyrians defeated out of all the Mitanni areas and expanded their empire. And eventually the Hittites, having the pressure from the Assyrians and losing battles to the Assyrians, and on their other side, the Western conflicts that they had, the Hittite kingdom came to an end. And there, Tukulti-Ninurta declares in one of his writings that at that time I set my foot upon the neck of the lands and shepherded like a herd the extensive black-headed people. So the empire grew. Tukulti-Ninurta, rather one of the tougher Assyrian kings, who also does an unusual thing, and we are going to see this again in the future with Ashur-uballit II. Tukulti-Ninurta moves the Assyrian capital, or the capital of his empire, from the old city of Ashur to what's called Kar Tukulti-Ninurta. He builds his own capital on the western or the eastern side of the Tigris. So far, the city of Ashur is one of the few Assyrian cities that's native in the heartland, that's on the western side of the Tigris. He built his city like all of the others cities, Nimrud, Nineveh, and Erbil, and other Assyrian cities. They're all on the eastern side of the Tigris. So he leaves. And unfortunately for Tukulti-Ninurta, he is said to be murdered in his own city by other Assyrians who unfortunately had risen in conflict against him because there was a bit of a civil war during this time. During the Middle Assyrian period, we also see Assyrian scribes engaged in writing many laws. Now, there's a lot of speculation about how these laws were applied, and I'm going to say more about this in the future when we study Assyrian laws. But Assyrian laws during the Middle Assyrian period are well known because they're cited and they have been examined and read in various tablets that have come down to us. Specifically they're classified as A through O, various tablets that have been found and kept in a number of museums. But as one author said, there are also older laws from the old Assyrian period, so really predating Hammurabi's law code, according to the words of the stele. In fact, that's the name of the article that I'll be happy to share with you. So what are Assyrian laws like? And they follow a particular pattern. If this happens, then this happens. So on, for example, individual responsibility. If a woman or wife or a daughter speaks slander or speaks offensive, in other words, accusing someone or saying something embarrassing or shameful about a man's dignity, for example, that woman bears responsibility, but to her husband, sons, and daughters, they will have no claim. Battery, you know the difference between battery. Battery is defined as unlawful touching or unwanted touching. If a woman put her hand on a man, they will sue her. She will pay 30 minas of lead, and they will hit her with 20 blows. Rape. If a wife passes the main street and a man seizes her and commits rape, they will kill that man. The woman will have no sin. And this is kind of a commentary on when in other cultures women were often accused as being accessories to a rape, even though they had nothing to do with it. So Assyrian law during the Middle Assyrian period, we're talking 1300 BC, were, not attributing the sin or the wrongful act to the woman, but to the man. And the punishment, as you can see, was death, execution. Adultery, if a man seizes a man upon his wife, meaning proving adultery, if he catches them in the act, they will kill them both. There is no liability for him. And this is kind of an honor crime. And in many cultures since this time, we see a lot of these laws, similar laws, such as these. If he seizes him and brings him before the king or judge, if the husband kills his wife, he shall also kill the man. If he cuts the nose of a wife, he will turn the man into a eunuch, and they will demolish the complete face. But if he releases his wife, he will release the man as well. So, in other words, if he punishes um, his wife, he also has to punish the man. If he does not, he releases both of them. And one of the most interesting, which is cited in the interesting laws, which is cited in the case of Roe v. Wade, reference to the fact that the Assyrians had laws on abortion, is if a woman causes her own abortion, they prove the charges against her and convicted her, they will impale her and not bury her. So the punishment for abortion, unlawful abortion, was death during the Assyrian time. So it was fully illegal. Now, again, there's a question of how these laws were applied exactly and whether they were applied in jurisdictions. We just don't have the information to say how were they applied, for example, in particular courts. That information has not passed on to us. What has passed on to us is the laws as they were written. Now, I want to say one thing about the growth of the Assyrian Empire during this time. And I will answer your questions in just a couple of minutes, because I want to say something and I want to kind of lead into the next class after this. The growth of the province system began to incorporate other people, in particular the Mitanni and the Arameans, into the Assyrian state structure. And this says something about the identity of those people. And we're going to refer to a number of authors who talk about the identity of these people. Why? In particular, because this issue has become very relevant. Who are we today? Are we Assyrians? Are we Arameans? Are we Syriacs? Are we Chaldeans? And so on. So I want to address it from a very historical, objective, in an objective and historical manner, and then allow you to kind of see what the truth is in history, what evidence we have, and then to make a judgment on it. So one of the authors, Mirko Novak, who's written extensively on the Middle Assyrian period, writes new cultural or even linguistic elements might have been adopted and caused a redefinition of cultural codes and definitions. In other words, identity. One of the cultural codes and definitions. We do not have any indication that the descendants of the deportees, people who were brought into an area and lived in that area after one or two generations, define themselves as anything other than Assyrians. So the Assyrian, in other words, the Assyrian identity was growing at this time, and it encompassed other peoples who were previously, say, Hurrian or Aramean or others. They were assimilated into what became the Assyrian identity during the Middle and then the neo-Assyrian period. And I want to just say one thing about the deportations, because that happened also during the Middle Assyrian period, and we're going to discuss deportations of peoples also during the neo-Assyrian period, because this is very important. Now, a lot of authors have said, you know, the Assyrians were very cruel. They caused the deportation of people, and it was very miserable. It was, you know, like the Native American Trail of Tears. And, well, one author in particular has come out and said that actually that's completely wrong. The deportations were not really only a form of punishment, but they were a necessary building up of the center and an opportunity for people who were taken into the center to earn a living, a better living. And so you see in Assyrian artistic representations that a lot of people who were deported into the Assyrian heartland, for example, or taken from one place and taken to another, are allowed to travel as families. And according to Karen Radner, who is a very prominent Assyriologist, she makes the point that Assyrian artistic expressions are often very detailed, and they have no qualms about showing violence. So they always show that when people were traveling, when they were being deported from one area to another, it was a very humane way of allowing people to travel. So this is very important. And this is a time when Assyrian identity is also built on a lot of success. So people are assimilating, as the author Mirko Novak is saying here. After one or two generations, they are defining themselves as Assyrians.